Hello and welcome back to these COP updates from the Wildlife Trusts, by which I mean updates about the Conference of the Parties meetings that are happening this autumn. That is the Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity that happened and finished just a week or so back. And of course, the Conference of the Parties to the Climate Convention, the UN Climate Convention, which has started today in Azerbaijan. So, as you all know, I was at the COP16, the 16th Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. That was happening in Cali, beautiful Cali in beautiful Colombia. And that finished just over a week ago. Kathryn, I'm back. I made it back late last Tuesday night. My suitcase hasn't made it back yet, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's a bit of a shame, isn't it,
Yeah,
Craig? So
yeah.
glad you're back in one piece.
Iberia still hasn't told. They can't quite tell me whether it might be in Mexico, apparently, or it might be in Madrid, but it's not with me yet, unfortunately,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a shame. But yes, it's a few days after the end of COP16. So in this update, we're going to look back a little bit at the Nature COP and work out what happened there. And after, with a few days to reflect on it, see what we think is significant or not about the Nature COP. And of course, we're going to now look forward to the Climate COP that has started today. So, yes, Kathryn, tell us, the Nature COP in Cali, it ended sort of dramatically in one sense
Hmm.
by not ending dramatically.
Yeah, as we had suggested actually in our last video update, it did the final plenary, which is where we were seeing all of these different texts coming to the big negotiating room and desperately trying to get them signed off. And there weren't many that were ready before that final session, so it was always going to be a really difficult ask. But what we saw was what we thought. It actually timed out because a lot of the delegates had to catch flights home,
We
and that
were worried about, we called this right, didn't we? We were worried that that would happen.
yeah, yeah, and this does happen from time to time, especially I think at a COP where maybe countries, it's not one where you're trying to agree an entirely new global framework like COP15, where I think people probably did plan to stay over by a few days and they were expecting it to run quite a long time, but it ran for 10 hours, the final plenary. I mean,
It went
nobody would
right
want
through the
to.
night, didn't it?
It
On the
did
Friday night
until
into the Saturday morning, yeah.
yeah, and then it kind of fizzled because they were doing these regular checks, I think, to see how many delegations were still in the room. And if you don't have enough, you have to stop. And what that means is that's it, that's the end. So we saw agreement on some of the issues, and some of the issues that we were really keen to see move forward, and that was quite positive. But obviously, others just didn't get where they needed to be. And we saw, particularly with digital sequencing information, that did get an agreement. It was, I suppose, a slightly partial agreement. So we have seen the setup of a new fund, the Cali Fund, obviously, which is sort of a global levy on products that are based on genetic resources from nature. And the idea behind that is certain types of companies. There was a lot of discussion, I think, about which companies would be in this. Certain types of companies are now going to need to put a little bit of their profits, around 1%, into this fund to obviously distribute. It's not legally binding, so it's a voluntary-ish measure. But yeah, what did you think about that, Craig? I mean, did you get a sense that people were feeling positive about that afterwards?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really significant actually that the principle that's been established here. I mean, you're 100% right to say it's only voluntary, it's not binding. You know, you can easily pick holes in it. There's all kinds of problems with it. But I mean, actually, fundamentally, what almost 200 countries around the world have agreed, including, the likes of the UK, the EU, and many others, is the fundamental principle that where big corporations are making money, making profits out of sequencing the genetic information from biodiversity, that they should be paying into a fund both to protect that biodiversity and actually to help, in particular, the indigenous communities and local communities whose role they
Mm.
play in protecting that biodiversity as well. And this is one of those times where I think, if you ask right now what's going to happen as a result of this, it might be quite limited in one sense. It now needs action from countries to take this forward. And I would say, particularly, we would look to the UK and the EU to try and offer a leadership role on this, to try and roll things forward on this. Particularly noting, of course, remember that the United States has never been a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it is going to be the UK, the EU, and a few other rich countries that really have to lead on this to make sure this turns into something. And we should recognise as well, actually, the UK, the government, in terms of UK civil service, played a crucial role in co-chairing the working groups that led to this. So I think the UK could and should feel really proud, actually, of the role that we played in helping make this happen. So, and just to say, Kathryn, I was worried when you didn't have the final gavel come down at the very end of COP16. I was worried that might mean that none of these things actually stood, but we have had it confirmed. The General Secretary to the convention was very clear that the things that were agreed earlier in the meeting still stand. So, you know, technically they stand, even though the final gavel of the whole meeting didn't come down because the meeting was suspended for the reasons you mentioned before.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And the other thing that I know a lot of people were really pleased to see was they've also set up a new formal body for Indigenous groups. And that
Yeah.
was something that was coming through the whole COP and actually is really quite unique, I think. I don't think
Yeah.
any of the other UN conventions have that. So maybe we'll see that start to happen with some of the other UN
And
conventions as well.
there were huge celebrations on this actually in the convention hall at the time. You know, this was seen as a massive breakthrough.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And of course, we didn't see progress on some of the other issues we wanted to. So the whole thorny issue of setting up a new fund, you know, that they really tried really hard. And actually, I think now countries are thinking, gosh, if it was that hard at COP16, what's COP29 going to be like, where finance is the key issue? And we also obviously saw that a lot of countries are still behind on the pledges they made at COP15 to produce these national biodiversity action plans. So I think we only had 44 by the end of the COP when we need around 196.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see those going into next year. And what happens now for the issues that didn't get finalised at this COP is they roll into what's called the intersessional meetings next year, which happen in the summer. So we'll see countries reconvening to try and push those forward.
But actually, before we move on, Kathryn, I just want to say, I think for me, there were two other, you know, actually quite standout achievements from Cali as well that perhaps didn't get so much attention, but I think are worthy of a mention. There was this agreement on the Global Action Plan on Biodiversity and Health. I think this was significant because this was a real recognition that the health of people and health of ecosystems are linked. And particularly, it was an action plan that was agreed trying to avoid and help curb the emergence of zoonotic diseases and preventing non-communicable diseases and promoting sustainable ecosystems. And of course, this has very much come out post-COVID. I mean, it was not just COVID, it's like most of the pandemics that have happened over the last few decades, whether you're talking Ebola, SARS, NIPFA, HIV, AIDS, of course, their origin has all come from zoonotic diseases, in other words, escapes from wildlife populations into human populations. Almost certainly that was the cause of COVID as well. Not fully established yet, but almost certainly that's the most likely cause as well. And of course, the risk of that is going to ever increase. The risk of future pandemics is going to ever increase for as long as we continue to fragment and erode wildlife ecosystems and indeed trade in wildlife species and wildlife parts. So I think actually this One Health agreement was quite significant. You had almost 200 countries agreeing to that. And the other one was, I mean, it sounds ridiculous because it's so obvious, but actually the first time really in this biological biodiversity convention was an explicit recognition between climate change and biodiversity and the two crises, and actually the need to have more of a read across between the two conventions, between the biodiversity convention and the climate convention. I mean, that seems really obvious, but you and I know how these things work, these UN conventions. You know, governments like things in nice little neat silos, and they get very worried if you start to have any kind of formal read across between the two. So actually getting any agreement on that was quite significant as well. What's your sense on that, Kathryn?
I mean, I'm thinking back quite a few years. The last COP I was part of the negotiating team for was in 2005. And I remember having discussions about crossovers with the CBD and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at that COP. And so it's been talked about, you know, for many, many years. I mean, given how overwhelmingly difficult COP negotiating processes are already, if you think with COP16, you were trying to get 196 countries to agree to, you know, dozens of different texts down to every single word. Imagine putting biodiversity and climate together and trying to do that. You know, I just think that would be completely unmanageable.
It really
But
would.
I agree with you. I think getting the read across between them and getting a joint understanding of the mutual linkages between the two crises and the need to address them both together is really important.
Yeah. So I think overall, in terms of the Cali COP, COP16 on biodiversity, I would say, obviously there's a lot of things that weren't achieved that would like to have been achieved, particularly around the funding side of things. And we need to see the rich countries step up and do more and trying to unlock the blocks and funding and many of the other things we were kind of talking about. But I think there was a real danger that this COP could have become a bit of a interregnum COP. We had the big excitement that happened in Montreal a couple of years ago, the agreement of the global biodiversity framework, and it could have been a sense that this was just a little bit of marking time, checking in, and so on. I don't think it was that at all. I think the Colombians played a blinder, if I'm honest. I think this framing of peace with nature as a COP, and obviously the leadership played by the Colombians, and particularly the COP president,
Mm.
Susanna Mohammed. She's a very, very impressive person, and how she kind of really tried to forge agreement at this COP. And I think they got some really successful outcomes from this COP in the scheme of things. If you understand how slowly these COPs move and this whole process is moved, I think actually in the scheme of things, they achieved some pretty significant outcomes. And it's a real shame that in a way, the meeting then ended in a bit of a whisper. Just we've got to kind of keep building that momentum forward through to the next biodiversity COP, which will now be, we can reveal, of course, Kathryn, in 2 years'
Yeah,
time in.
it'll be in Armenia. So the two countries in the running for the vote were Azerbaijan, which is now hosting the climate COP, and Armenia. It's
And there's obviously
relative.
political tensions between those countries that
Yeah,
many people will know.
yeah, they're obviously very close together. It was an interesting pairing, I thought, to get to the last two. And actually, the reason why Azerbaijan was chosen for the climate COP was because at the last COP, Russia blocked every other option on the table. And that just tells you something about what's going on with the politics behind all of this. So there's a real shift in that region to start hosting these meetings. And we could talk a little bit about what we think is going on there. I don't think it's all wholly optimistic on climate action or nature action, but there's clearly a business focus on both of those, and actually a business focus on nature, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Kathryn, what do we have to look forward to? What are the big issues over the next couple of weeks at the climate COP?
Well, in terms of what to look forward to, we haven't had
Probably
huge
not the best
hopes.
way to put it, perhaps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we haven't had huge hopes for this COP since, a year ago. Um, However, it's obviously got off to an even worse start now because we've had stories coming out last Friday that say the CEO of the COP, Elna Sultanov, has been caught trying to make fossil fuel deals in the margins. That was Global Witness, I think, that recorded him doing that. He's not the president of the COP; he's the CEO, but he's part of the senior team. And it's got real overtones of COP28 in Dubai, where we had real rumblings that was going on as well. And of course, we've got the US election results happening a few days
Yes.
before.
Which kind of does trump over everything, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, we've been here before. I think those of us who have worked in climate change for quite a few years feel, history's repeating itself a little bit, but at the same time, things are very different now to where they were in 2020. We've seen a doubling of renewables capacity since 2020 when Trump last left office. The economic case for investing in green energy is much more strong and almost overwhelming really now than it was before. So there's been a lot of talk. I mean, everybody will know what that's been like. I'm going to be really interested to see what China does at this COP, and also actually what China's been doing by the end of the year on its greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, the experts who measure these things are looking quite closely at China's emissions this year because they might actually have dropped this year compared to previous years. And I think the only other time that's happened was during COVID.
Everyone's
Yeah.
been waiting. Everyone's been waiting for when the world is going to pass peak emissions, and of course, that's never going to happen until and unless China passes peak emissions. So, if China reaches peak emissions, there's a bit of a hope that globally we might finally reach peak emissions and then start falling, and then all the dynamics of the energy transition start to change pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll be keeping a close eye on China. I'll be keeping a close eye on India because they usually have quite a lot of influence over some of the really tricky discussions. We're expecting at this COP they need to agree a new global finance target, and they're talking about trillions of dollars now, not billions of dollars. That'll be really interesting to see how the presidency handle that and where that ends up. But on a positive note as well, obviously the UK is gearing up to be really ambitious at this COP. So we're expecting the Prime Minister to attend. He's on the list of heads of state who are attending the high-level segment at the beginning, and we're expecting them to make a few announcements, which should be hopefully pretty interesting. I don't know if you've got any
Like
insights on
what?
those. Well, hopefully an updated nationally determined contribution, which is the pledge that all countries are making under the Paris Agreement to ratchet up their emissions reductions. And we saw the Climate Change Committee last week giving advice on what they think that new NDC, as it's called, what the level should be. And they've gone for an 81% reduction in emissions by 2035. So the previous NDC was, I think it was a 68% reduction by 2030. So that's a big jump forward. If the government signs up to that advice, that's quite a strong message to be giving. But yeah, I wonder what else the Prime Minister and Ed Miliband, who's also attending, obviously as head of delegation, we'll be watching closely, and obviously watching what the UK government does, watching what the presidency does and how they react. We'll be bringing another one of these updates at the end of the COP to kind of wrap up from what's happened, but we'll also be putting out reactions to what's happening on social media through the 2-week process as well. And it's starting with the high level segment, which is where the heads of state come together and do their speeches and have all of their bilateral negotiations. So it'll be interesting to see what the tone is, coming into this.
Very good to talk to you again, Kathryn. I'm going to get back onto the Iberia phone line and try and find out where's the latest about my suitcase. But for now, thank you very much for joining us for this Wildlife Trust double COP update. Make sure you follow our social media channels. Make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks so much. For now, goodbye.